Off the coast of France, an international team is exploring a hidden battlefield, looking for the secrets of how the greatest naval invasion in history unfolded. Buried here is a treasure trove of ships, tanks, and potentially unexploded mines. These are the wrecks of D-Day. June 6, 1944. For years, Hitler had devastated Europe, killing millions. Now was the time for the Allies to make their move.
It was an all-out gamble. It was nothing less than the history of Western civilization.
But the odds were against them.
To tell, it's about as bad as combat can get.
3 years in the making, this was the most epic struggle of the 20th century.
These are the men who made the difference. You should understand that.
D-Day required the best minds in the military, working with scientists and engineers.
D-Day is a triumph of technology and engineering.
The guys that planned the logistics for this were unbelievable.
New machines to break through Hitler's vicious defenses. Ingenious and untested ways to deliver an invading army.
I always knew it was big, but I think this makes you feel how big it is.
Today's expedition investigates how the Allies tipped the odds in their favor.
Oh, look at that.
And brings veterans back to the place where they nearly lost their lives.
I bet you never thought you'd see that again.
Oh, I tell you.
New technologies and veterans' memories come together to reveal this hallowed ground.
This hidden battlefield is one of our most sacred charges.
Right now on Nova, D-Day's Sunken Secrets.
Major funding for Nova is provided by the following. Boeing, where the drive to build something better inspires us every day. The David H. Koch Fund for Science, supporting Nova and promoting public understanding of science. And the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by PBS viewers like you. Thank you. Additional funding for D-Day Sunken Secrets is provided by the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, dedicated to strengthening America's future through education.
Along the north coast of France is the picturesque region of Normandy. Charming villages, farms with their patchwork of small fields, and beautiful beaches where Parisians come for a holiday. But few realize that just beyond these tranquil beaches is evidence of the biggest and the most dangerous naval invasion of all time. The violence of that battle still lives in the World War II wrecks that lie just off the coast. These wrecks tell the story of D-Day. June 6, 1944. 7,000 warships, 11,000 airplanes, and 200,000 men. Crossing at dawn from England to these beaches at Normandy to liberate Europe from the Nazis. 4 years earlier, Hitler had conquered most of Europe, killing millions, and setting up the most epic struggle of the 20th century. All along the north coast of Europe, the Nazis had built a vicious wall of defenses to stop just such an invasion. D-Day took 3 years to organize and was the Allied forces' best chance to retake Europe. But the odds were against them, and the future of the free world hung in the balance. It has now been 70 years since this battle that changed history, but the magnitude of that invasion still inspires awe. How did the Allied forces of Great Britain, the United States, and Canada, depleted by years of war, manage to pull it off?
One of the things we're learning is to treat the evidence of 20th century battlefields as proper archaeology.
Nick Hewitt, an historian at the National Museum of the Royal Navy, says that these D-Day wrecks can tell us things no official document can.
The beauty of the D-Day underwater battlefield is the evidence is still there. It's all laid out for us. All we have to do is interpret the evidence to tell the story.
What is the true story of this invasion? It's referred to as D-Day. But what do these wrecks reveal about the invasion and how long it took to secure a foothold in Europe? And what tales do they tell us about the necessary engineering that made all this possible?
D-Day is a triumph of technology and engineering. And what you see is specifically engineered solutions to specific problems.
Buried here are inventions of scientists, engineers, and even maverick businessmen, some of the unsung heroes drafted into this immense war effort. These wrecks comprise one of the largest underwater archaeological sites in the world. And it is beginning to get the closer examination it deserves. To understand this hidden battlefield and these inventions, an international team of oceanographers, historians, and archaeologists has set out to examine the evidence buried here.
This is a new wreck, okay. It's a new one, yeah? And it's right off Utah Beach.
There are hundreds of ships as well as tanks, guns, and potentially unexploded mines. The expedition team uses the latest in sonar technology and even deep-water submarines to investigate the remains of this epic naval battle. Undiscovered evidence is being charted and explored.
Yes.
Like this American Sherman tank, one of the iconic weapons of World War II. How did this weapon, intended for a land battle, end up here, intact and underwater? It's mysteries like this that the expedition will investigate over the next 6 weeks.
There are a few areas in the world where you have so many wrecks concentrated in one area.
Sylvain Pascot, the director of the expedition, believes a systematic exploration of this lost fleet is necessary to give a true picture of what this battle really was.
Oh, look at that.
When we think of the D-Day landings, we think of a land battle. We think of great movies, we think of boots on the beach. But actually, 6th of June 1944 was the biggest, most complex amphibious landing in history.
The expedition starts off with a sonar-equipped catamaran named the Magic Star. On board is the latest generation sonar submerged underwater in the middle of the boat. Sonar uses sound waves transmitted through the water to image what is below on the ocean floor, like this British ship. For a solid month, the Magic Star will sail back and forth in up to 40-mile stretches. Each pass revealing long strips of this hidden battlefield. It's like mowing a lawn, a 200-square-mile lawn, that is, with each pass overlapping the last to make sure they don't miss a spot.
Voila. Voila. très très bien.
or a ship on the ocean floor below.
Oh, yeah.
This survey phase will reveal potential targets for further investigation, like the mysterious sunken tank.
We're right at the edge of the caisson.
On board is Andy Sherrill, who leads the team of sonar experts.
Ralph will run you through how to mark a target. We collect one line of data at a time, but as you can see here, we're combining line by line by line. We're trying to build a very large underwater archaeological map of the whole area.
This area covers the site of the D-Day naval battle, where the Allied forces, led by Britain, the United States, and Canada, sought to regain a foothold in Europe. 4 years earlier, the Nazis had conquered France along with much of Europe. Ever since, the Allied forces had planned in secret how to fight back. They needed to win a toehold in France and then could drive up to Berlin from the west. The Soviet Union would push in from the east, choking Hitler in the middle. The stakes could not have been higher.
What is at stake was nothing less than the history of Western civilization. It was an all-out gamble. It was pushing all your poker chips onto the center of the table.
Captain Henry J. Hendricks, the chief historian for the U.S. Navy, says what was involved in pulling off D-Day is hard to even imagine today.
The Germans had literally years to prepare the defenses of the beaches. So they're ready. They know if Germany is to be defeated, the Allies have to re-enter the continent somewhere. So the question is really where.
The options for the invasion were limited, and they had already tried unsuccessfully in other locations. 2 years earlier in France, the Allies tried to capture a port in a town named Dieppe. That battle against the fortified German positions there was a disaster. More than 60% of Allied soldiers were killed or captured. This failure haunted British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and changed the course of the war. In response to previous failures, President Roosevelt and Churchill met several times in secret to create a new strategy. The plan they devised was to overtake the region of Normandy from the Nazis, and the naval invasion was just the beginning. The entire plan was codenamed Operation Overlord. It would be a surprise. The Nazis had expected an invasion at Calais because it was so close to England and had a port. Instead, the decision was to go further down the French coast, where there were no large ports, and target the beaches of Normandy with a massive amphibious landing, a much more difficult operation.
In an amphibious operation, generally, there's no middle ground. You either succeed or you don't. You get ashore and you move inland, or you get thrown back into the sea, unlike most battles where you can retreat and fight again the next day. You can't retreat in an amphibious operation.
Overlord and Normandy is really the big gamble about whether democracy as we know it was going to continue and survive and grow and flourish, and that people would be free as we thought that they should be free, or whether Nazism and the atrocities that Hitler was committing, genocide, was going to succeed.
In the end, 5 landing beaches were chosen: 2 American, 1 Canadian, and 2 British. They were given code names of Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. But even its chief architect wasn't sure this plan would work. The night before the invasion, General Eisenhower wrote a letter taking the blame if it failed.
My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, The air and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault is attached to the attempt, it is mine alone.
Perhaps the best way to understand why Eisenhower was so worried is to stand on Omaha Beach and see what the Allies were up against.
Omaha Beach is an excellent defensive location. If you're the Germans, what you want to be able to do is kill anything on this beach.
Adrian Lewis, a former Army Ranger, is a history professor at the University of Kansas, and he has taught military strategy to West Point cadets.
The geographic formations here, the terrain makes it excellent. From one end to where the landing takes place to the other end here is about 4 miles long.
Lewis says any fighting strategy must begin with understanding the geography of the battlefield.
Omaha Beach is banana shaped. That banana shape is important. So instead of having your weapon systems pointing out to sea, what you would do is actually have them pointing into the beach. So if I put machine gun positions, artillery positions on this flank, and then I put more on this flank, instead of having them point out to sea, I'm actually having them pointing in, and that's what the Germans did.
This inward pointing fire or interlocking fields of fire created a deadly kill zone on the beaches. This was a huge advantage for the Germans.
Excellent terrain for putting in a defense. As a matter of fact, if I was doing this thing, I'd rather be on the German side.
In addition, the cliffs that surround the beach gave the Nazis the high ground. It seemed that nature gave them every advantage in this crucial battle.
You're up against the weather, you're up against the tides, you're up against the beach. And when you're dealing with forces of that size, it's hard to get it done in the right way.
This area off the coast is known for unreliable weather and some of the strongest ocean tides in the world. Those conditions are even difficult for today's expedition.
We've got 3 challenges: the weather, the tides, and the current. I just cannot imagine 5,000 vessels with 200,000 men and conditions like that. If you disregard the weather, the current, and the tide, you would be going absolutely nowhere.
Ocean levels here can rise and fall up to 25 feet a day. The effects can easily be seen over the course of a few hours on the beaches. Here, when the tide is out, the width of the beach increases, a full 300 yards wider at low tide. The significance of that is it meant the soldiers on D-Day would be exposed for much longer to the deadly German crossfire. D-Day planners needed to understand every detail about the geography of this battlefield to plan for the assault. But how do you get that information when the entire country is under enemy control? Evidence of the incredible effort to figure this out still exists at the United Kingdom Hydrographic Office, one of the world's leading producers of navigational charts. This building was an important intelligence site, its location a state secret. In fact, the building was camouflaged to hide it from Nazi bombers. Inside, top-secret documents still exist. Neptune was the code name for the naval operation. These artifacts aren't quite like the sunken wrecks off the coast of Normandy, but they are important evidence of ways the D-Day planners found around the obstacles, an effort that began long before the invasion.
Mines here. Barbed wire entanglements here.
Cartographer Chris Howlett explains that mapping the Normandy region was an extraordinary top-secret operation that required math, science, and daring spy missions. low-flying aircraft were dispatched over the beaches, and surveillance photographs were taken at intervals throughout the day, documenting the changing tides.
These black lines are where the waterline was on different tides.
Why was this useful? Using those different tide levels, mathematicians could calculate the exact slope of the different beaches, necessary to figure out what vehicles could be used. Knowing every detail of the beach was crucial. At Dieppe, the Allies discovered only after landing that their tanks could not get traction on the beaches there. Every way of getting information was used. Even past vacation postcards were requested.
They put out a public request for the people of Britain. Any postcards you collected in your holidays to France before the war, send them in to us and they may be of use. And millions of postcards were sent in.
These postcards gave essential information about what the coast of France, by now in enemy hands for 4 years, looked like. But not all the necessary information could be gleaned from a safe distance. Just off the Nazi-controlled beaches lurks an X-craft. Inside this mini submarine are 5 underwater spies.
Perhaps one of the earliest phases of the battle was the survey and preparatory work carried out by men serving aboard miniature submarines, the X-craft, who were effectively secret agents.
The X-craft were 50 feet long and barely 5 feet high. Some missions lasted 2 weeks in these cramped quarters. The surveillance gathered was used in making these maps, including some from the perspective of the sea, showing visible landmarks on the beach, like church steeples or houses. These were crucial for navigating the landings.
They came up with a novel idea. The view at the bottom here is the view that you would expect to see if you were coming in from a landing craft at any given point along this map.
Jim Booth was a member of this elite submarine force, venturing into mine-filled Nazi-controlled waters with barely any navigational guides.
Navigation, of course, was difficult because then there was no sat-nav. A classic old-fashioned navigational trip, pencil and ruler and gyro compass.
Booth's mission was to go ahead of the invasion force and set up light beacons so the huge armada of Allied ships would know where to go. His submarine was assigned to the British landing beach codenamed Sword, the furthest east of the 5 beaches. He would be one of the first soldiers in action on D-Day. He was in position at 0100, military terminology for 1 a.m. Today, Jim Booth has come back to Normandy to take part in the investigation. This is no leisurely retirement cruise. The D-Day expedition has brought in a team from Canada with 2 deep-water submarines.
The veterans who stormed the beaches of Normandy, they're the most incredible people.
No one can bear witness with the same kind of emotional intensity that someone who was there can. We're losing about 600 veterans every day. When they slip away, they're in the shadows forever.
For the first time in 70 years, Jim Booth will go underwater off the coast of Normandy, just like he did for D-Day.
I suppose a very small amount of worries, because he's 92.
I haven't been in a submarine at all since then, no.
I think you'll find you can see a lot better from that one than you could in yours.
But we had no window, of course, at all.
Ironically, this time the submarine is even smaller than the X-craft.
Okay.
But Jim Booth will only have to stay in the submarine for an hour instead of the 4 days he did before D-Day. Today's dive is in the exact same location off of Sword Beach. His shipmate is military historian Nick Hewitt.
Any second now, you're going to be underwater for the first time in 70 years.
70 years, absolutely, yeah, I know.
Here we go.
Right, here we go, look.
Look at that.
Look at that, isn't it amazing?
Isn't it just?
It's reasonably clear too today, isn't it?
They got target straight ahead.
The wreck's about 15 metres below.
Thrusters enabled topside.
10 meters.
There's a shadow there.
There is something there, you know.
Roger, I've got visual.
Jim's role on the 6th of June is to mark the safe channel through the enemy minefields. So Jim has to go out with a small group of men in advance of the landings, navigate themselves to exactly the right spot, surface alongside, we must remember, a minefield, light a beacon so that the incoming ships can pass safely through. So we need to keep our eyes peeled.
It was in this spot off of Sword Beach that Jim Booth placed the beacons on D-Day.
Did you have an understanding of how enormous the scale of it all was?
I think almost everybody, it was just a tiny cog in this vast wheel.
Yeah.
His sub surrounded by mines, Booth and the X-Craft crew had to find the exact location to set up the beacons. But with no lights on shore or radar, how did they do it?
Very, very complicated. One has to remember that all the navigational aids had been switched off because of security. And we knew we were in France. It didn't take very long to be recognized. There was a church tower. And we did recognize that.
In the end, Booth and his X-Craft crew navigated using the landmarks that had been mapped by the hydrographic department. Booth says it was the Allies' attention to detail in the planning that made the difference. And that was a direct result of the lessons learned from the disaster at Dieppe.
Dieppe was really intended to be a test run for Normandy. It did all the things wrong. Those lessons were learned, and this was put into good force for Normandy.
But the one thing the Allies couldn't control was the weather for the invasion. And the forecast did not look good. By May 1944, 2 million soldiers were in southern England waiting for the go-ahead from their commanders. And with 11,000 airplanes and 7,000 ships involved in this complicated operation, decent weather was required. But the science of weather prediction was not what it is today. General Eisenhower and his Supreme Allied Command had only limited information, since satellites and weather radar wouldn't be invented until after the war. Instead, weather data was collected at remote weather stations and sent to the UK Meteorological Office in Essex, England. Records like these, dating back 150 years, are still archived here, including those for the D-Day landings. These maps detailed weather patterns and were meticulously drawn to chart moving storm systems.
These were the weather maps that they used for that process. These maps are reproduced every 3 hours, whereas nowadays they would be only done every 6 or 12 hours.
High and low pressure systems, the atmospheric conditions that determine the weather, were charted and analyzed at the headquarters.
The low pressures are basically bad weather, strong winds, rain, a lot of cloud. The high pressures are mainly fine weather, lack of cloud, and quite warm temperatures in June anyway.
At the center of the operation was Group Captain James M. Stagg. His responsibility was to track the weather data and report it directly to General Eisenhower. He kept a personal diary that is still held at the Meteorological Office. It shows the enormous pressure he was under. The invasion was originally planned for June 5th.
Saturday, June the 3rd. A day of extreme strain. The weather situation got worse. 2 depressions below 98 millibars at 1 in June. Who could have forecast this?
This map was from June the 3rd, and this is showing typical bad early summer weather in the UK.
Before D-Day, there were several storms lined up.
We've got a succession of low pressures across the chart. One here, one to the northwest. And these are going to keep the weather what we call unsettled. So cloud, rain, and gale force winds in the channel. We're going to stir up very rough seas. So anybody who's on a boat crossing the channel would be in danger.
June the 4th, 1944. At 04:15 conference this morning, assault for tomorrow definitely cancelled.
The bad weather would limit air support and create treacherous conditions for ships on the channel. The invasion force is put on hold, but time is running out.
Today it began to appear that there might be a temporary fair interval Monday night. Should we advise to make use of it?
The timing of the invasion had been selected to correspond with the lowest tide of the month. This would give the Allies maximum time to unload men and equipment. With the tide low and coming in, ships can unload and be carried out to sea on the rising tide. If the tide were high and going out, boats would get stuck on the beach as the water receded.
If you are on a ship that makes land or gets close to land at high tide and suddenly the tide turns against you and the water is running out, you either need to leave then or your ship is actually going to come and ground in the mudflats.
Because of the changing tides, Eisenhower could only wait one more day. If the weather didn't clear, the invasion would have to be postponed for weeks.
I am now getting rather stunned. It is all a nightmare.
Every day they waited, there was an increased chance that German intelligence would discover the huge invasion force poised at the coastline and realize that the invasion was coming. If discovered, the crucial element of surprise would be lost.
This is the chart for Monday, June the 5th. This was the original D-Day. There were some crucial observations which made some of the meteorologists start to think that the 6th could be possible. And these observations were up here in the north of the Atlantic. And interestingly, they marked things on here which we don't nowadays call coal.
Coals are a gap or interval of calm that can exist between bad weather systems.
Coals exist between areas of low pressure, and these were quite important for this situation because they knew if they could get into an area of a coal, the chances for getting the right weather for the landings were better. It wasn't a definite, but it was a possibility.
It's Eisenhower's decision. The momentum had already built up. I've got everybody locked and cocked, ready to go. The fact that the weather was so bad actually made it one of his harder decisions.
Monday, June the 5th, after 1 hour's rest, Met conference at 0300. Fair interval confirmed, an invasion put on final and irrevocable decision. Whatever the outcome, the decision is taken.
Following this weather report from Stagg, General Eisenhower ordered the invasion to begin. Later, he broadcast his blessings to the troops.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking.
D-Day had begun, and there was no turning back. The armada of Allied ships left England and would sail through the night to the 5 different landing beaches.
The scale of it is almost inconceivable. It's 7,000 ships.
And they include not only the ships that are carrying the infantrymen who are going to go to the beaches, but they include bombardment ships.
Battleships after battleship and destroyers.
All of those have to be launched from Britain. There's an intense choreography that you will go here, you will go there, you'll do it at this hour, and so on.
It was the most massive naval force that's ever been assembled.
D-Day is without doubt the single biggest, most complex amphibious landing in history.
The naval plant, Operation Neptune, encompasses 50 miles of beachfront, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of ships and landing crafts. The magnitude of it is incredible.
The landings were set for 0630, early the following morning. On the shores of Normandy, the Germans could only see the bad weather and thought that it would prevent any immediate invasion. They also did not see that just off the coast were a handful of small X-craft submarines. On board one was Jim Booth.
It's a hell of a time ago, isn't it? 69 years. Obviously it is emotional, very emotional. It is very emotional indeed. It's sort of in the direction of the yacht, but where the last ripples are, you know, that sort of distance, yeah. We saw the soldiers playing football. Yeah, you know. That's the day before, actually. So they didn't know, did they, what was coming?
Off the coast, Jim Booth and the X-craft submarines were not alone. An 18-year-old Robert Haga from Virginia was aboard the USS Chickadee, one of the ships that left England ahead of the Armada to perform the essential task of clearing the minefield that the Nazis had laid. An extremely dangerous operation.
June the 5th, 1944, underway for France.
Haga kept a personal diary of these historic days.
The invasion will be early in the morning. We have to go in first and sweep a channel clear.
The Germans had heavily mined the English Channel as part of their Atlantic Wall. Mines in World War II are like the IEDs of today's wars in Iraq or Afghanistan. Low-cost weapons, but highly lethal. The Magic Star team has not found any unexploded German mines so far, since they were largely cleared for safety after the war. But can the sonar reveal their effect?
Well, this is pointed up here, so it looks like a bow.
It's broken off.
Yeah, get it a mine.
They come across a Canadian ship called the Fort Norfolk. Its bow was broken off by a mine.
The edge is just unbelievable.
That is a gorgeous, gorgeous wreck.
One mine can have a disproportionately large impact, sinking a whole ship full of soldiers and equipment.
The important thing about all naval warfare is the equipment or the men contained in a ship are an awful lot easier to destroy at sea than they are once they've got ashore. A single mine could drown all those men and destroy all their equipment. It would take days of fighting to do the same job on land.
One place you can safely see some of these mines and other military hardware is the Museum of Normandy Wrecks in a little town called Port-en-Bessin. It is a private collection of D-Day military equipment salvaged off the coast here. Axel Nies-Lee, an expert on the German military, says the Nazis used 4 different kinds of mines in the ocean off Normandy. The most common was a contact mine.
The whole body is filled with explosives. Once it goes up close to a ship, it can sink a battleship.
These mines were anchored to the ocean floor and floated just below the water's surface. The horns are detonators, something like a very large off-on switch.
And once a ship hits one of these detonators here, a chemical reaction is started. The detonators are ignited, which is a primer, and then the full charge is going off.
The Nazis had heavily mined the bay just off the beaches, and so the Allies had to sweep lanes clear just before the landings.
We waited to the last instant. Minesweeping tells you where the landing is going to occur. If you begin too early, then you have already tipped them off on where the operation will be focused and concentrated.
Haga's boat was third in a line in the minesweeping operation off of Omaha Beach, next to the USS Osprey.
At 1800, the USS Osprey was hit by a mine. I was on the bow of the ship, and when it hit, the ship just lifted out of the water and exploded. This mine hit the magazine that carried all the ammunition in the ship.
Six men on the Osprey were killed in the initial blast. These were the first casualties of D-Day.
A lot of the crewmen were blown out into the water, and they were badly burned. We were throwing rope ladders over as fast as we could, but they couldn't see, so we were having to sometimes hook onto each other to pull them up, and the skin would come off their arms. I still have bad memories about that.
Haga has returned to Normandy as part of the expedition and wanted to see the newly installed Navy Memorial at Utah Beach that honors many of his fellow minesweepers. The minesweeping operation went on in view of the German-controlled beaches in the hours leading up to the invasion. Everyone was haunted by the possibility that the soldiers there would sound the alarm. But that never happened. Perhaps because as part of the operation, the Allies made a massive effort to mislead Hitler into thinking that the invasion would be further north along the coast near Calais. Fleets of fake military gear were positioned in England across from Calais, and an extensive counterintelligence campaign was organized to deceive the Nazis.
It's one of the most brilliant deceptions in the history of warfare. It's right up there with the Trojan horse.
Not the Trojan horse, but on the night before the invasion, another wood vehicle was slipping behind enemy lines unnoticed, under the cover of darkness. There are two large rivers that cross the road between Normandy and Paris, the Caen Canal and the Orne River. The Allies realized they needed to capture these bridges and other strategic targets before the landings or risk getting trapped on the beaches. It was urgent to get men behind enemy lines and secure these targets. But how do you do that without modern Apache helicopters? One possibility was dropping paratroopers, but loud airplanes could alert the Germans, giving them time to blow up the bridges. So instead, the job fell to men like Kermit Swanson, a farm boy from Minnesota, trained to fly a silent wood glider behind enemy lines.
Our mission was to fly that glider over there and land and try to keep from killing ourselves. You know, if we did, we had completed most of our objective.
The objective was made more dangerous by the landscape of Normandy. This farming region is known for its patchwork of small fields with fences formed out of a dense hedge of rocks and trees. The plan was to land in the cover of darkness and those hedges would not be visible.
You couldn't see because it was dark.
The gliders could carry 12 men or even a jeep, land, and jump right into action if they landed safely. These planes were made of wood and fabric with a thin metal frame and would easily break apart if they hit an obstacle.
It was terribly dangerous to fly a glider. It was dark, it was overcast, you were having to land into the little small fields. I don't think anyone would want to be going 90 miles an hour and crash into a tree with only plywood as a barrier.
The commander for Allied air forces predicted in a letter to General Eisenhower that the gliders could suffer casualties of up to 70% on D-Day. The plan was to tow them across the English Channel with C-47 planes just after midnight. When they reached the drop zone, their tow rope would be cut. Then the pilots had about 3 minutes before they had to land, no matter what obstacles were in their way.
You're now traveling at about 80 miles an hour. Now you make a turn, downwind, and you've got 3 minutes and the wheels are going to be on the ground. You've probably got 3 minutes of your life left.
Swanson, now 94 years old, says it was the last 30 feet of the descent that was the most dangerous, because you might hit a tree.
It must have been 20, 30 feet off the ground. Didn't even see the tree. And I hit the ground like that, and that took the wheels off. And then you slid till you stopped. And everything got perfectly quiet. And perfectly black. And I said, anybody hurt? And the guys behind me said, nobody back here. And about that time, a cow bellowed real loud, real loud. I said, now you know where you're at. We were in the pasture.
Once on the ground, these troops moved into position to take the strategic targets.
And what you're trying to do with these troops is to prevent the Germans from counterattacking in your flanks. Before you've got enough combat power ashore to repel these attacks.
The glider operation went better than expected, with less loss of life than predicted. The troops took control of the strategic targets without alerting the German command. Along with the gliders, 13,000 paratroopers were dropped into France with a mission to disrupt the German defenses. These men were the very first Allied soldiers to touch French soil on the morning of D-Day. Back at sea, the armada of ships was approaching the coastline behind the minesweepers, with Robert Haga aboard. Jim Booth and ex-craft crews were at work setting up the beacons. The next obstacle was getting 150,000 troops on shore, something that the Nazis had spent years making sure would not happen.
Germans were good engineers. They knew how to build bunkers, I tell you. All right, the thickness is from there to about here.
Ever since invading Europe, the Germans worked to build massive fortifications all along the north coast of Europe, including 15,000 bunkers overlooking the beaches.
I mean, just take a look at this. You can see the entire beach. And if you can see something, you can destroy it.
At this point in the war, the Germans knew their troops were stretched thin, so defending their hold on the beaches was essential to their strategy.
The defense is the strongest form of war. If your defense is well done, if you have enough obstacles, enough minefields, enough firepower, you can reduce the number of troops you need.
Along the coast of France, these bunkers held powerful guns that could shoot 20 miles. And the beaches were covered with a series of mined obstacles hidden just below high tide that would destroy any ship that tried to land, including the famous hedgehog, crosses of steel that could rip open the bottom of a ship. All of this was part of one of the most fearsome military fortifications ever built. It was known as Hitler's Atlantic Wall.
The Atlantic Wall was strong, and it was getting stronger day by day.
In the 6 months before June 6, Hitler allowed almost unlimited resources to be thrown into it. So it's pretty serious.
One of Hitler's top generals, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, was sent to the front by Hitler himself to fortify this powerful death trap. The beach obstacles dictated a terrible choice to the Allies. Do you land at high tide so your soldiers spend less time on the beach exposed to enemy fire? Or do you land at low tide to protect the ships from these obstacles?
Operation Overlord runs on the backs of ships. So the men are coming, the tanks are coming, the supplies are coming. And so it's important that the ships survive. It's all to preserve the logistics ships because those are the irreplaceable items of Operation Neptune. Without them, Neptune fails.
General Rommel knew that landing at high tide would offer the shortest run to safety for the soldiers. At high tide, these deadly defenses would be hidden. But the decision had been made to land at low tide. The ships would be protected from the deadly hedgehogs. But how do you protect the soldiers? The answer would come from an unlikely place. A town better known for music than the military, New Orleans. Andrew Jackson Higgins was a colorful local boat builder who believed he had the solution for the Navy. He already had a boat called the Eureka that was built to navigate the shallow waters of the Mississippi River. Not Rommel's deadly mines, but the logs and sandbars here. So why not use them for beach landings? The Navy was skeptical. It seems Higgins didn't always follow military protocol.
As the Depression was going on, business was bad. And then he started building boats for rum runners. Then he went to the Coast Guard and said, I don't know if you noticed it, but the opposition has a lot better and quicker boats. And then he would build faster boats for the Coast Guard. Then he would go back to the rum runner and say, you know, the Coast Guard has newer vessels. We need to build you something a little faster. So he did play both sides of the fence.
Today, at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, they're working to rebuild some of Higgins' famous boats. Tom Chikansky, the chief curator at the museum, is an expert in military hardware. He says to understand what makes a Higgins boat work, you have to look under one to see the unique engineering of the hull.
The important thing here is that the hull churns up the water at the front. Gets lots of air in it, and if you got water and air mixed together, that's getting the boat up just that little bit more that gets you onto the beach.
At the back of the boat, there was a specially designed metal structure that ran below the propeller to protect it when the boat ran aground.
Bring the boats on in and dam the obstacles.
The Eureka boat was designed for unloading cargo over the sides of the boat, like illegal liquor. But the Navy's cargo of soldiers would need to climb over the sides, making them vulnerable to enemy fire. Was there a way to get the men out faster? Naval engineers had seen Japanese boats with front-loading ramps, but no one knew how to build them. and so they asked Higgins to draw up some plans.
The Navy had been trying it for over 2 decades, had been unsuccessful. They wanted drawings. Higgins said, drawings hell, you be here in 3 days and I'll have one in the water, which he did.
Without a ramp, it took 57 seconds to unload troops. With a ramp, it took only 19 seconds.
But they could land quicker, exposed for a shorter time to enemy fire. And with them, they could land their vehicles for a fast mechanized assault.
Which saves you 38 seconds from being shot at on an open beach, which saved incredible numbers of lives.
Adolf Hitler knew of Higgins' famous boat and is said to have called him the new American Noah. Not unexpectedly, the sonar operators are unable to find any of these wooden boats. It would have been difficult for them to survive the strong currents of the English Channel for 70 years. But there were many other landing craft made of metal, which did survive, and they come in all shapes and sizes.
All of these wrecks, they're just out here and you don't know it. If you could drain this, people would go, God, look at all of that, you know? But you can't.
Pretty big, though.
In World War II, there were dozens of different kinds of landing craft, all engineered for specific tasks. The famous Higgins boat carried soldiers called personnel, or possibly a jeep. So the boat was labeled Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel, or LCVP. There were landing crafts with powerful guns, appropriately called Landing Craft Gun, or LCG. The list went on. LCI for infantry, LCM for mechanized, LCR for rockets. And there was a whole class of larger ships like the LST, or landing ship tank.
I can't even imagine, you know, we get confused. We're sitting here looking at something trying to decide whether it's an LSM or an LST or an LSVP. I mean, there's massive amounts of LSs. The guys that planned the logistics for this were unbelievable.
Today, the sonar team sees the signal of an enormous ship longer than a football field.
All right.
Even though the ship is buried beneath 100 feet of water, this new multi-beam sonar is accurate within half an inch.
Looks like it's busted up.
Millions of sonar points are detected and then translated into a three-dimensional image that reveals intricate details of the engineering.
We'll go by it again.
This level of visualization allows the team to make precise measurements that help identify the ships.
These are maybe the front doors here.
They make out what looks like a bow door and what the sonar team thinks is a vehicle still on the ship's deck.
See that?
These features help them identify the type of ship, which they can cross-reference with a military manual. The ship they've discovered today is an LST, a landing ship tank, the workhorse of the Allied naval forces. LSTs were some of the largest landing vessels in the fleet and played an essential role in the D-Day invasion. They addressed one of the biggest problems created by the new amphibious landing strategy. How do you get all the gear the Army needs onto the land?
One of the ways to look at an amphibious assault is that it's a race. The race starts the minute you hit the beach there. And it's a race for buildup. Who can build up the most forces the fastest?
World War II, tank warfare dominates. And so you're bringing a lot of tanks across the channel. They're not flown in, they can't drive there. And so tanks, jeeps, other vehicles, all had to be brought by ships.
You don't need a port to use an LST. These are the chess pieces that get moved around that global board, and they are probably the single most important type of ship used in assault landings anywhere in the Second World War. Massively important piece of technology.
The U.S. manufactured so many of these LSTs, they didn't even bother to give each ship a name, just a number.
These ships were built in the United States and then sent to England, hundreds of them. We had to change virtually every bridge on the Ohio River and on the Mississippi to allow these combatant ships to make it out to the ocean, and we did it very rapidly.
One of the key elements in our technology was our ability to build overwhelming numbers. That production was an amazing factor in our victory over Nazi Europe and Japan.
American production, American capacity to produce volumes is what made the difference. You know? We could produce 50 to their 10. Yeah, we win. You know?
On the morning of D-Day, these LSTs ferried men across the English Channel. But they were too big to land before the German defenses had been cleared. That's where the Higgins boats came in.
In the early assault phases, you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. You don't want to put a big, vulnerable ship on the beach. So you have the famous Higgins boat and the British equivalents, which were small craft capable of carrying 30 men who could get into action immediately. And to be really crude about it, if you lose one, it's not the end of your operation. It's 30 guys, not 800.
This landing chart shows where the large ships like the LSTs pulled up on the morning of D-Day, 11 miles offshore. Then there are smaller paths into the beach for the landing craft, like Higgins boats. For Ralph Wilbanks, mapping these wrecks on the ocean floor is more than just sonar science. His father fought in the Pacific, which makes these two-dimensional images really come alive.
These boats that are blown up and pieces missing from them, and I mean, even one they dived on the other day had big holes in it. You could see where, something happened violent that caused that boat to go to the bottom, which had to have been really catastrophic for the crew that was on the boat when it happened. That's the reason they were the greatest generation.
It's very present to you even today.
Yeah. Tough place.
And as dawn broke on D-Day, it was about to get a lot tougher. The massive fleet appeared just off the German beaches, a scene made famous in the 1962 film, The Longest Day.
And what's headed?
If you've seen that classic scene in The Longest Day, when the German is in the pillbox.
Nicht mal mögen zu sehen.
And the morning mist begins to lift, and then stretched out in front of him from as far on the, from the east to as far on the west as he can see are ships, and they're emerging out of that fog.
Invasion.
It was the most massive naval force that's ever been assembled.
At 05:30, it was time for the Allies to bring out their biggest guns. And the naval bombardment began.
You have to imagine battleships standing maybe a mile, 2 miles offshore.
This is going to happen right around sunrise, because you've got to be able to see what you're shooting at.
So you're hurling these large bunker-penetrating projectiles about the weight of a Volkswagen. It's tremendously loud. It's loud unlike anything that you can possibly imagine. The smell of cordite burning, of gunpowder burning, is something that you won't forget.
The Air Force bombers also joined in.
The Americans had made the decision that they were going to have a very truncated preparatory fire. It only lasted 35 minutes. If you were invading an island in the South Pacific, sometimes the naval gunfire would last for days. But because you're invading an area where the enemy can reinforce quickly, the decision was made, let's do it quickly, let's try and get on the beaches quickly. The British preparatory fires lasted closer to 2 hours. I think the British were right, as it turned out.
The channel was full of boats. The pillboxes were up on the cliffs. And they were firing continuously.
Bill Allen was on an LST, bringing soldiers into Omaha Beach, and remembers this brutal start to the day.
I remember all the firing, the noise, all the disaster, the death. You'd see someone had been killed floating on the water.
Allen was a medic with an overwhelmingly difficult assignment.
I was on the death detail that started bringing casualties out to us. And we loaded casualties over the side of the ship. By the time we would get them, we'd be dead. But we'd clean them up best we could, identify them to the fact that put the dog tags. And you try not to really dwell on it, I guess.
Painful memories like these prevented Allen from talking about his D-Day experiences until recently. But today, he has come back to Normandy for the first time since 1944.
Welcome on board.
He is once again on a ship off the coast of Normandy. This time, he isn't tending to casualties, but instead he has brought his wife, Ida Lee, 2 daughters, and 2 of his grandchildren.
When I was here before, everything was so confused and noisy. Now it's so calm and peaceful, it's hard to realize the difference between the two.
Allen's LST delivered men into Omaha Beach on the morning of D-Day. Then, on their 4th trip into the beaches, they hit a mine, and the boat sank. Today, the sonar crew can show Bill just what happened to it.
So oh, look, here comes something. There's the stern.
Boy, that is something.
I've been doing multi-beam survey work for over 25 years. And when we had Bill, the veteran, on, as soon as he saw that image, his stories, his memories came back. It was a way I'd never seen multi-beam data before.
Look at that big hole there. You think that's from the mine here?
Oh, as far as I know, it would almost have to be.
Because you could see fully the vessel that was blown out from under him on the sea floor.
You had a galley in here, down below was where we ate.
It's the first time I felt that the multi-beam data had a soul.
After 70 years of holding back his World War II memories, Bill Allen, now at 88, is brave enough not only to return, but to go down in the small submarine to see the ship he was on when it sank.
Okay, Bill, I'm going to get in the sub first, and I'm going to get myself into the pilot seat. We've got a ladder that we're going to drop down in.
Not to brag on him, but I can't think of too many 88-year-old men who would go down to where they almost lost their lives and revisit it and be excited about it like he is.
It's exciting. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay.
One of the most important aspects of looking at this now and not waiting any longer is that we still have veterans with us. We can still hear the testimony of those who were there while we investigate the battlefield they fought on. If we wait any longer, there simply won't be anyone left.
The details of that horrific day slowly come back during his dive with sonar expert Andy Sherrill.
Hard to believe, huh?
Yeah, I tell you.
Think we should go try to find the bow?
Yeah, I'd like to see it.
I'd like to see it too.
We made 3 trips in successfully. And started on our 4th trip.
How old were you?
Just barely 19. I had finished lunch, come out on top side, and it was about 1 o'clock. I don't even know how to describe the noise that it made. So it reminds me when you step on a banana peel and you know how you flip-flop and expect to hit the ground sooner or later.
LST-523 was sailing in rough waters when it came down midship directly on a German mine. Alan was at the bow of the ship, in front of where the mine exploded.
It just blew the ship completely in half.
And it happened so quick.
Yeah. Real state of panic. Everyone began to jump off.
On today's dive, Alan wants to see where that mine hit.
Looks like we're coming up on some debris here, Bill.
Uh-huh.
And it doesn't take long before the expedition submarine is right on top of it.
Yeah, topside. We are on the wreck at this time. Over.
This is all that remains of the LST-523, a rusting hulk of metal overgrown with barnacles and algae.
There's a tank.
Oh, yeah, look at that.
Oh, yeah.
They can barely make out a tank on its surface.
I bet you never thought you'd see that again.
No,
The explosion tore through the ship, and the bow that Alan was on was sinking. Everyone began to jump off.
I knew I wasn't too good of a swimmer, but I knew that something had to be done pretty quick because our bow was going down. What it boiled down to was which way I wanted to drown. Do I want to go down with the bow or do I want to drown swimming?
Just at that moment, Alan saw a life raft with a medic he knew from Mississippi.
And he hollered at me, he said, "You can't swim out here. Just stay there. I believe I can get in there to you." He got within, I guess 12, 15 feet of me. And I said, "I can jump that far. I know I can." And I took off and made it. We both just had one arm hung over the raft. We picked up 4 more Army personnel.
Alan and the others were saved when a passing ship spotted their raft and pulled them to safety.
Every time you close your eyes, you just reliving the same thing, a blast and seeing those same sights. And it was sometime after midnight, I rolled over. Jack said, "Bill, have you been asleep yet?" I said, "Jack, I don't think I'll ever go to sleep."
They
523?
Yeah. On the ship, we had a complement of 145. The final count, 28 of us got off. 117 was killed or lost.
For Bill Allen, another powerful way to reflect on his time during D-Day was taking his wife and family to the American cemetery that overlooks Omaha Beach.
Daddy, what's the name you're looking for?
Stabile.
It's just never ending.
There are more than 9,000 American soldiers buried here. One of them was Allen's commanding officer, Vito Stabile.
That's Stabile, Bill.
Yeah?
That's him.
a young doctor just out of medical school.
He was an officer, the rest of us were enlisted men. But we were all shipmates. There wasn't that much distinction between us. And had a great life ahead of him, but he got stopped. But I appreciate being able to come to his grave very much.
In World War II, 70 million people are killed. 70 million people. It is the most significant event in the 20th century, bar none. Nothing comes close to it in terms of shaping the world that we lived in. And so when you stand at that cemetery, these are the men who made the difference. Yeah. These are the men who did more to shape the world that you live in right now than anybody else. And you should understand that.
The loss of life weighed heavily on D-Day planners. Minimizing casualties was a solemn duty and strategically essential. One way to reduce casualties on the beach would be to make sure the bunkers of the Atlantic Wall were taken out before the infantry landed. But doing so would prove to be one of the biggest challenges on D-Day. The naval and Air Force bombing just before the landings were the first steps to dismantle the bunkers. But then the guys on the beach also needed to have the big firepower of tanks.
One of the attributes of a tank is firepower. Main gun of a tank can destroy bunkers, machine gun positions. It can penetrate some of those concrete positions. Small arms fires, even machine gun fire from infantry will not do that.
The Allies had tried to put tanks and landing craft at the battle for Dieppe, but the process of unloading made them sitting ducks and contributed to the slaughter. So for D-Day, the Allies needed to figure out how to get the tanks to the beach quickly without putting them in boats. So the engineering question was, can you turn a tank into a boat? Nicholas Straussler specialized in engineering military equipment in England. He had immigrated from Hungary, now under Nazi control. Straussler took inspiration from the ancient Greeks. Archimedes discovered that any object could float if it displaced enough water to offset the volume that submerged. Archimedes' principle was engineered into Straussler's design by deploying an inflatable skirt that came up on the sides of the tank about 4 feet. It turned the tank into a rather poorly designed but adequately floating boat, at least in calm waters. You can see how Straussler pulled off his design on this tank, retooled by Bob Grundy, a military vehicle expert. There is a framework made up of inflatable support tubes that are then wrapped by a canvas skirt. They were called duplex drive tanks, or DD tanks. With the push of a lever, the support tubes deflate and the skirt would drop. So the tank was ready to roll into action. These floating DD tanks were to hit the beaches 5 minutes before the troops went ashore. But on the morning of the invasion, the seas were dangerously rough, with swells recorded at 6 feet high. When the tanks off Omaha Beach were launched, they immediately started to sink, wave after wave.
Let's say that you're one of these guys in a DD tank. Put yourself in the place. So 4 of them in an LCT. First one rolls off into the water and immediately starts to sink. And the second one rolls off into the water, starts to sink. You're the third guy. What are you going to do? I don't know. I don't know. You ask yourself why.
It's pretty hard to understand 70 years later. It was pretty hard to understand then. These were their orders. It was critical to get these tanks ashore. Even though you saw that the guys in front of you were having trouble, in some cases had gone under, they kept pushing.
There is a mystery about how many DD tanks are still buried underwater. The definitive answer will come from the expedition's comprehensive sonar survey.
Once we close the hatch, the submersible is pressure-proof.
I'm a retired soldier. Spent 20 years in the Army, but haven't done much with the Navy. Going down in the subs was a unique experience for me.
All right, Adrian.
Hey.
Time to go.
All right. Sounds good.
Today, Adrian Lewis and Andy Sherrill are going down in the submarine off Omaha Beach to investigate what happened to the DD tanks. Sherrill has located a group of tanks not far apart.
The bottom in sight. Tanks over there.
2 battalions of 32 DD tanks were supposed to lead the way onto Omaha Beach.
You know, most of them are gone now.
Without them, the infantry would inevitably suffer from an unrelenting German attack.
Visibility is hard to see, isn't it?
Right, yeah.
We got something straight ahead.
Oh, there we go. You can see the main gun now.
Oh,
Yeah, that's it.
That's nice.
That's it.
The water in the English Channel is so murky, it is only with the help of sonar coordinates that Sherrill and Lewis finally locate one of the lost DD tanks.
Yeah, you don't see the skirt on here anymore.
No.
But yeah, that was
right around
canvas.
that edge, though.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that would have deteriorated and
Yeah.
gone away. When we first saw the DD tank, I didn't recognize it.
It's pretty cool, huh?
Yeah.
These swimming tanks were not engineered for the 6-foot swells they found on D-Day. In all, 27 tanks sank off of Omaha Beach.
Looks like the hatch is open.
Yeah, it does.
One of the front hatches is open, which would make sense so they can get out. My first thought is, you know, the men in this tank, the soldiers in this tank, who they were and did they get out. Those tanks are burial places, essentially. You have to keep that in mind.
Despite the loss of tanks, the Higgins boats, full of soldiers, arrived on the beaches right on time. But the battlefield they faced was not what they were expecting.
If you're an infantryman on Omaha Beach at 7:30 in the morning, you're really sorry you don't have more armor with you. Because it's hell. It's awful. It's about as bad as combat can get. And there are men by the dozens, then by the hundreds, who are being slaughtered all around you. And so the fact that you don't have the protection of a 33-ton Sherman tank next to you, firing back at that pillbox over there or firing at that machine gun nest over there, all you've got is your rifle. It means that you've got a difficult row to hoe for the next several hours.
combat engineers trained with explosives to blow up beach obstacles like mines and hedgehogs landed in the first wave.
The job of those engineers was to blow gaps in these defenses. They were to blow 12 gaps on Omaha Beach. About half of all those combat engineers were killed, wounded, or missing.
Along with the floating tanks, the plan had counted on Air Force and naval bombings to take out the German bunkers. But it did not work. And so the men on the beach faced the Germans alone.
I made the argument that generals failed. Generals failed. The plan did not work at Omaha Beach. This is why the cost was so high in terms of American lives, in terms of numbers of soldiers killed, because they had to generate the combat power necessary to get over the bluff there at Omaha Beach.
No, there was no failure. In fact, the failure is entirely on the side of the Germans. Omaha was a lot harder than they thought it was going to be, but look, the Germans had 4 years to build the Atlantic Wall. It took less than 4 hours to crack the Atlantic Wall, including at Omaha Beach. Once those initial soldiers have scaled the bluffs at the back of the beach, and they are up on the escarpment, even though the war is not over, the Battle of Normandy has hardly been won, the Atlantic Wall has been cracked.
Wave after wave of infantry kept coming. By 12 noon, after several hours of brutal fighting, the first Americans had fought their way onto the bluffs overlooking Omaha Beach. The cost of that victory was very high. Even today, there is confusion among experts as to the total casualties, with estimates ranging from 2 to more than 4,000 in the battle for Omaha. The landings at the other 4 Allied beaches went more smoothly, with far fewer deaths, although they were not without significant valor and casualties. It is argued that one reason things might have gone better on the British beaches were a group of inventions that the American Army decided not to use. Ian Hammerton, a tank driver on Sword Beach, still has the landing map from the hydrographic department that he carried in his pocket on D-Day.
It suffered a bit from seawater, but that was taken, that's top secret.
Hammerton's unit is famous because of its leader, Major General Sir Percy Hobart.
He was an innovative character who wouldn't take no for an answer.
Hobart was known as a brilliant but eccentric character who Churchill specifically called back into service for the preparation of D-Day. His unit was known as Hobart's Circus.
Hobart's Circus, it was called, because from time to time all sorts of ideas were dreamed up for dealing with situations, and we acquired all sorts of strange equipment.
Hobart's goal was to engineer a way around the Nazis' deadly obstacles. One of his most famous inventions was the flail tank used to clear mines.
This is a model of a flail tank made by my son.
Ian Hammerton, who piloted one of the flail tanks on D-Day, shows how it worked.
It's an ordinary Sherman tank, but it has this apparatus on the front. The chains on the front, it would spin around on this drum and thwack into the ground. They're like this. That's a part of a chain that got blown off.
The British actually have a more inventive approach in some cases. The Americans have the attitude, We don't really need those on our beaches. It complicates our training. And there's a bit of a not invented here quality to it. Those are British gadgets. Let the British play with them.
Hobart's engineers invented all sorts of clever ways of overcoming the German obstacles, which became known as Hobart's funnies, though their purpose was anything but that. Flamethrowers for incinerating anyone inside the concrete bunkers, devices to fill anti-tank ditches or create an instant bridge. On June 6th, Ian Hamilton's flail tank did successfully break through the defenses at Sword Beach and help clear the terror mines. Bill Allen's LST-523 unloaded men bound for Omaha Beach in the morning, and that afternoon they began to receive the casualties. And Robert Haga, the minesweeper, kept working to clear the lanes through the German underwater minefield. By nightfall on June 6, 1944, all 5 landing beaches were under Allied control. Determining the exact cost in lives lost is difficult, but it is estimated that there were at least 10,000 casualties, including 2,500 deaths. But more death and destruction was yet to come, as the D-Day expedition will reveal. The goal of Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion, was not just to gain a foothold in Europe. It was to secure all of Normandy and ultimately drive through to Berlin. Carver McGriff, who landed on the other U.S. beach, Utah, says to understand the difficulty of fighting in Normandy, you need to walk around the small farms that lie just off the coast here.
Imagine you're a young second lieutenant leading 25 kids like me, and your job is to take that next hedgerow. What do you do?
Despite all the years of planning for the invasion, the Allies were not prepared for the obstacles they would face in the battles here. The problem was easy to overlook. It was the ancient fences which surround farms in Normandy, called hedgerows. They seem so unassuming. One aerial photograph of 8 square miles revealed nearly 4,000 small fields.
There's a kind of terrain known as the hedgerow country. This is fields that basically have turned into mini fortresses. The French have been farming that area for a millennium, and every farmer has cleared his land by pushing the rocks and debris and trees and whatnot to the edges of his fields, and consequently walls have been built around the fields.
The hedgerows were a virtually perfect defensive way for the Germans to fight the battle. And we had to find a way over them or around them.
There was so much focus, so much energy on getting ashore that the follow-on tasks, the advance, were not given the attention that they deserved in terms of figuring out how you need to break through this stuff.
The battle for the hedgerows consumed the Allies for much longer than expected. By the time Normandy was securely under control 6 weeks later, another 200,000 Allied soldiers had been wounded or killed, including McGriff's squad leader.
He died while lying next to me. In fact, he tried to talk to me and then was not able. It's a long time ago. The memories don't hurt like they did for a while, but they're always there.
It's important not to think that once June 6th turns into June 7th, that somehow the war becomes less intense. The fighting in the hedgerows is as awful in some cases as anything that has occurred on Omaha Beach. So the intensity that we see on June 6th is simply a foreshadowing of what's going to come over the next 3 months in Normandy.
So what did it take for the Allies to win control of Normandy in terms of men and supplies?
We can spend more time with the DDAY. So one of the things that amazed us the most, I think, was the amount of wrecks we found, the targets. And we ended up finding 400 targets during our survey. That's a lot of wrecks.
Can you look at the back of it?
The most astounding revelation by the sonar experts inside the Magic Star is that the vast majority of those 400 wrecks were sunk after D-Day, revealing the extent of the enormous effort required to reclaim Normandy.
The really exciting thing for me as a historian is we can peel back the water and expose the playbook of Normandy, just like assembling a huge jigsaw puzzle. And it's just fascinating. So we have evidence of when the troops went ashore, and then we have evidence of the support phase that took place for months afterwards. All of that is there.
Today, the divers have found a barge carrying unusual cross-beam structures, components used to replace bombed-out bridges in France. The barge was headed to one of the most extraordinary engineering projects of World War II, something designed to make it possible to unload all the necessary gear and men. It was, in fact, a pet project of British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. In London, just down the street from Churchill's wartime headquarters, is the Institution of Civil Engineers, where evidence still exists of this ambitious plan. These reams of detailed drawings all resulted from a short, angry memo written by Churchill himself. That memo got passed along to Tim Beckett's father, Alan, a young military engineer.
My father was working at the time in the bridging department of the War Office. Colonel Everall came to him with this memo and said to him, "Beckett, you're a yachtsman, see if you can make something out of this."
The memo resulted from a disagreement between President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill about possible locations for the invasion. Churchill was worried that there was no port in Normandy, and so these landings could turn into another Dieppe. His solution was as bold as it was daring. If the Allies couldn't take a port by force, then they would need to build one and take it with them.
It's astonishing, the scale of it and the organization required.
Tim Beckett, a port engineer himself, says the plan was astoundingly ambitious. Certainly, the engineering challenges were. No one had ever conceived of building a portable port. Any port must first provide shelter for ships from the fury of the sea, and it must also have a way to dock and unload the ships. How could they engineer around the notoriously rough seas and changing tides on the coast of France, and anchor a port onto the sandy beaches there? Churchill didn't want to hear.
It says, piers for use on beaches. They must float up and down with the tide. The anchor problem must be mastered. Let me have the best solution worked out. Don't argue the matter. The difficulties will argue for themselves. Well, I think you can read into that Churchill was pretty frustrated, shall we say, when he wrote that. It's a bit terse.
The challenge of figuring out how to solve these engineering problems fell in part to the young Alan Beckett. His initial idea was to build a road that would float up and down with the changing tide. The problem was basic physics. how do you control the movement of a floating road on a rough sea?
Most bridges have typically 4 bearings, and they like their bearings to stay more or less where they are. Now, when you put a floating bridge on, you've got a whole load of movements. Obviously, it's pitching and going up and down and rolling, and then you've got all the load going on it as well. Now, you either try and resist that with a rigid structure, trying to hold it all together, or you go with it.
Beckett decided to go with it. He designed a floating road that consisted of pontoons sitting on the water with roadways, like a bridge, spanning between them. Another part of the design were massive structures that are still visible today at low tide off the coast of Normandy. Like a jetty, these huge concrete blocks were used to hold out the rough sea.
That's awesome. Seeing the caissons that are submerged now.
Seen on sonar, these structures make up some of the largest wrecks off the coast here. But to see what his father created, Tim Beckett goes just outside of Paris into the world of virtual reality.
I think you recognize this place.
Certainly do.
A French engineering company called Dassault Systems has recreated one of these artificial harbors in 3D.
We're walking along it, aren't we?
Yeah.
It's as if we could touch it.
The code name of the project was Mulberry, and so these were known as Mulberry Harbors. 2 harbors were built, one for the Americans at Omaha Beach and one British at the town of Aramash.
This is really very good.
Take your 3D glasses and we'll jump into the 3D.
The basic design of the Mulberry Harbors was to create the needed breakwater to block out the rough seas. This was done in 2 steps. First, old ships were sailed over from England and then dynamited and sunk. Next came concrete structures, each the size of a 5-story building. They were built in England and pulled across the English Channel. These massive concrete blocks, called caissons, created the jetty that held out the waves.
I think the floating roadways he was particularly proud of.
Then came Alan Beckett's roadway that stretched from the beach over floating pontoons to piers where ships could dock. These roadways needed to be strong enough to carry a 33-ton Sherman tank, and yet flexible enough to accommodate the water's motion. Engineering around this was the key to Beckett's plan.
You can see that the pontoons are pitching and rolling, and the bridges are following it. The bridge spans are not rigid, they can go with the motion. They do it by a rather clever detail. Can we go underneath the bridge, this bridge unit? We've got a rigid connection on the central member here, and then all the other ones are pinned, and that's what allows the bridge to twist torsionally. I always knew it was big, but I think this makes you feel how big it is and how busy it was. It was the busiest port in the world for a few weeks.
There are such things as war-altering technologies that once it's revealed that you have that capability, it changes the face of battle. To take an LST, a landing ship tank, and land it on the beach and put the ramp down, it would take it 10 to 12 hours to offload.
That's because huge ships have to work around the tides, and all of that takes time.
When we established the Mulberry Harbors, where we put piers out, we were able to offload a ship in 1 hour and 40 minutes.
And all of this was anchored by a clever system that held the roadways in place, designed by Alan Beckett. Astonishingly, the first of 2 massive harbors were functional in only 3 days after the landings. But then, not even 2 weeks after the harbors were built, disaster struck. One of the worst storms of the century blew down hard on the coast of Normandy. The American harbor at Omaha Beach was completely destroyed. But despite being designed to last only 3 months, the British Mulberry was in use for nearly 10, during which time it became known as Port Winston, for the man whose angry memo got it built. In all, 2.5 million men and 500,000 vehicles passed across these floating roadways. They are just one of the many engineering feats and innovations that helped the Allies prevail in this crucial Battle of Normandy. The seas off the coast of France remained dangerous for months after the landings. The Germans still had control of ports to the east and west of the landing beaches, and so they could send in submarines or drop mines from the air.
All it takes is one aircraft to fly through fast at night and drop half a dozen pressure mines, and your nice, safe passage area is suddenly lethal again.
This is quite well preserved.
Today, the Magic Star crew has found a German U-boat submarine that operated in the English Channel after the landings, finally being sunk in July.
The German Navy, of course, put all its means it had available into the game.
George Bigelow was an Army private headed to the front. On Christmas Eve, 6 months after D-Day, he boarded the Leopoldville, a requisition cruise ship bound for France. A German U-boat submarine lurking off the coast torpedoed his ship. It sank, killing nearly 800 men.
If you can imagine Coney Island full of people swimming, that's just what it was like. It was just horrible. Guys were floating by with their heads down. You could tell they were dead. Other guys were praying to their mother. I couldn't talk about it for 20 years. It was that bad.
Today, Bigelow has joined the expedition with his daughter, Robin.
Bonjour. My father, George. I am Robin.
Bienvenue à bord. Welcome on board. Nice to meet you.
Instead of going down in submarines, they sent a robotic vehicle.
You're heading right 20 degrees.
And George could watch the dive on a video feed from the safety of the ship's cabin.
Oh, look at that. Looks like a porthole there, huh?
Yeah. That's very, very humbling experience for me to be able to see this.
That's the railing.
The railing's just like the railing that I had a hold of when I let go. Right now, I feel just very thankful and humble.
When the Leopoldville sank, Bigelow was thrown into the cold waters off of Normandy. He was one of the lucky ones. He was rescued and taken to a French hospital.
They put me in bed, and it's funny the things you remember, because this nice-looking red-headed nurse, she took her hand and brushed my hair back just like that, like my mother did when I was real young. It was the most peaceful feeling, and it put me to sleep just like that.
The decades are sliding by, and we have fewer and fewer eyewitnesses. And soon the only eyewitnesses we'll have are these wrecks, and they will still tell us their stories.
The D-Day expedition is providing new evidence of the scale and difficulties of the Normandy invasion, as well as helping to clarify the historical record. By the time the Allies stopped landing on the beaches in Normandy, months longer than ever planned, millions of men and vital equipment had crossed here and joined the battle to liberate Europe. For the last 70 years, the cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach has been the most powerful memorial to the incredible battle here and the high cost of freedom. Today, the D-Day expedition is providing another way to see and to honor this sacrifice.
I would make the argument for Americans, there's a cemetery that's underwater also. Americans should be knowledgeable of that.
The hidden battlefield of the tanks and the ships and the things that are scattered on the bottom is a cemetery in and of itself. There are literally hundreds of sailors and soldiers that have their final rest in the waters that lie beneath. And this is one of our most sacred charges.
The sonar data collected on the expedition can now be used to reveal this place that is for so many hallowed ground.
It's important that we maintain them, that we respect them, but that we also have this opportunity to examine them for the story that they still have to tell to us.
Perhaps the importance of the Normandy invasion is best summed up by a story about General Eisenhower, who asked to be reinstated in the Army after serving as President of the United States.
Why? Because in Eisenhower's own words, 500 years from now, no one will remember that I was President of the United States, but they will always remember that I commanded the troops at Normandy. And when Eisenhower was carried to his grave in Abilene, Kansas in 1969, he went in an $80 soldier's coffin wearing a military uniform with only 3 ribbons, the ribbons he earned at Normandy.
How can sandstorms in the Sahara transform the Amazon rainforest over 5,000 miles away? Why does a vast undersea waterfall in Antarctica lead to a feeding frenzy near the equator? Eyes in Space reveal the answer.
Satellites turn invisible processes into the visible things we can see and then understand.
Our living, breathing planet as you've never seen it. Earth from Space, coming soon on Nova.
Major funding for NOVA is provided by the following.
It's one of the most amazing things we build, and it doesn't even fly. We build it in classrooms and exhibit halls, mentoring tomorrow's innovators. We build it raising roofs, preserving habitats, and serving America's veterans. Every day, thousands of Boeing volunteers help make their communities the best they can be, building something better for all of us.
The David H. Koch Fund for Science, supporting NOVA and promoting public understanding of science. And the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by PBS viewers like you. Thank you. Additional funding for D-Day Sunken Secrets is provided by the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, dedicated to strengthening America's future through education.
The exploration continues on NOVA's website, where you can watch this and other NOVA programs, see expert interviews, interactives, video extras, and more. Follow NOVA on Facebook and Twitter, and find us online at pbs.org/NOVA.
This NOVA program is available on DVD. To order, visit shoppbs.org or call 1-800-PLAY-PBS. NOVA is also available for download on iTunes.
You're watching PBS.
What if we could unlock every mystery?
We're at the beginning of a revolution.
That's a huge discovery.
That's never been done before. Ever. Anywhere.
Touchdown confirmed.
No one feeds on curiosity like PBS. Give to your PBS station so future generations can keep asking, what if? What if television could sweep us away to another time and place?
Very nice, my lady.
Why can't our favorite characters step off the page?
That's the Jane I want to marry.
Who says TV can't be as brilliant as Holmes?
Shut up!
Or as bold as Macbeth?
Thou shalt be king.
And what if television could take us from the Gilded Age to the Great War?
Hold the line!
From the heat of the chase to the heart of a queen. No one tells stories like PBS. Tales as timeless as the classics that inspired them.
Please, sir.
Give to your PBS station and help bring stories like these to life, now and for generations to come.